Thinking with Oil and Water, Reflections on the Energy Humanities. So I'm going to begin today by reflecting actually on a term that I created for what I think of as a feeling state within the USA right now, a kind of a mode of feeling. I call it the everyday Anthropocene. And it's a mode of feeling that is a general sense of unease and suspicion that the systems which came into being within American colonialism and capitalism are now falling apart. And this unease even suggests to some of us that climate itself might be acting almost to avenge Earth, and perhaps to avenge too those indigenous peoples whose lives have been gravely impacted by the version of modernity that the US has promoted and even imposed on other peoples, animals, waters, and soils. I'll be thinking of this idea of the everyday Anthropocene as a bad mood that we Americans live with in this time. And it's a bad mood carried out in our compromised infrastructures. And here I would be showing you images of various infrastructures, so you can just imagine that. But old electrical grids that can't stand up to winter storms like the one that has just come down in Texas, old water systems and plumbing that leach benzenes and lead into drinking water in Texas right now, in Detroit, Michigan, earlier on in this decade, and in many other parts of the US. Failing coastal walls in North Carolina and Louisiana and New York. Both the pandemic and the world's ongoing climate crisis offer opportunities to rethink these neoliberal priorities, privatization, deregulation, for example, that have led Americans to devalue life, both internationally and in our own country. The bad mood of the everyday Anthropocene in the USA has a good deal to do with how we've conceived of energy and valued energy resources like oil, water, and human labor. The energy humanities has been imagined as a field of study that perhaps can clarify how we got to where we are at a moment of climate crisis, pandemic, and we hope, energy transition. The energy humanities also intends to help change the story of US energy towards one that is not only grounded in renewables like wind and solar systems, but also grounded in a stronger consideration for ecological and social welfare. Historically in the US, working bodies, including bodies of water like rivers, have been obscured by the spectacular aspects of North American energy culture as it developed up through the 20th century's peak oil production period worldwide, the 1960s. One of the first industrial processes to be regularly filmed in the United States was oil production. It figured almost exclusively in the dynamic image of the oil gusher. On film, oil was made to appear as an earthly force acting independently of the work crews who mined it. Petromodernity, which is my term for an American-style modernity that has been underwritten by oil, depends upon obscuring human agency and value and emphasizing energy. Can you all still hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'm sorry. I could hear a lot of noises all of a sudden. I apologize.
Sorry, some of the participants got unmuted. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. I just didn't want to continue talking and then find out that you guys weren't there. So anyway, petromodernity, what a term. And we're really, are we really in petromodernity when we're not sure we can communicate? I don't know, but this is a term for an American style modernity that has been underwritten by oil and depends upon obscuring human agency and value and emphasizing energy as an impersonal and spectacular power. And you may know that the Lumiere brothers, one of their very first films was that of a spectacular set of oil fires in Baku, Azerbaijan, which took place in 1896. But later in the 1920s, some lesser known filming took place, and that was by the California oil tycoon Edward L. Doheny, whose life story is the basis for the Hollywood film There Will Be Blood. Doheny actually insisted upon installing a film crew at his oil operations in Mexico for the purpose of filming gushers, which he described as, quote, the preeminent modern miracle. Now, 6 years ago, I published a book called Living Oil, and I'm going to talk a little bit almost personally about that book and how I came to write it, in the hope of being a little bit more approachable in a Zoom or, in this case, Teams context, when I think we need to be as entertaining as possible. So one of the first books, this was one of the first books to take the study of energy as a literary and cultural phenomenon. And one of the driving problems for me behind writing and conceiving of Living Oil was the seeming invisibility of oil production and labor, even in media that purportedly are about oil. At the time that I wrote the book, I was actually living in an old oil town in Southern California. And in fact, I was living in a house that was built in 1927 for oil workers. And yet, even in my town, the histories of oil production, leakage, accident, these were nearly invisible. So much of my project as a scholar turned out to be that of materializing or bringing to visibility the histories and ecologies of oil, which I began to see as among the most fundamental ecologies of modernity. The infrastructures of oil in the USA include highways and suburbs and all of the infrastructures brought about by the internal combustion engine and the automobile. They also include these infrastructures of oil, the movies, because for much of the 20th century, film stock was a petroleum byproduct. And even these infrastructures of oil include print books. Oil, of course, necessary for the transport and printing of books, but also the ink in many, many books is still primarily a petroleum byproduct. So oil haunts the literary and visual arts of the American 20th century. And as I was attempting to bring out these kind of hidden organizing structures of modern media, what I might call the fossil fuel mediascape, I asked myself, what is the relationship between literature, cultural criticism, and those energy systems that, for instance, keep my computer humming or maybe failing to hum, and that power the printing press, which made possible the publication of the book that I am reading and writing about. Now, at first, it seemed strange even to me that I was using the techniques of literary and cultural studies to try to make fossil fuel infrastructures appear, and in their appearance perhaps become, in some sense, more vulnerable or at least more approachable. I wanted to understand energy as Bruno Latour might, but also as Karl Marx might, or maybe if the two of them were in a conversation with one another in some dreamscape that I could invent, I wanted to understand energy as assemblages of specific material agents caught up in structures of power, agents that might include Los Angeles oil workers in the industrial sector of LA in the 1920s, or agents that might include the 31,000 miles of defunct oil pipeline that now is on its way to becoming coral reef in the Gulf of Mexico. So in other words, agents that are both non-human and human in these assemblages that make oil culture. In its most fundamental sense, the verb materialize means to make material or represent, hence its relation to literary desire, including the desire of scholarly writers such as myself to develop a sensory understanding of the systems in which we live, so as to know better at a kind of gut level how it is that we are enmeshed in these systems, and to begin, hopefully, to imagine ways of doing and being differently, especially when we're talking about systems that are so profoundly destructive in the long run. Now, the problem of materializing oil is a set of systems, as a set of physical infrastructures and structures of feeling, to use Raymond Williams' term, kept leading me to the problem of materializing water, which brings me now to the obvious point, I'm sure, to all of you, that water is also a form of energy. and an apt topic for scholars in the energy humanities. And I was now going to show a slide of a bunch of different energy humanities scholars, some who work on oil and fossil fuels and some who work on water. But that was actually kind of a boring slide anyway, so we can talk about those scholars in the Q&A if you wish to do so. I'd be happy to name some bibliography if you want to hear that. And now, I was intending to write about oil's cultural and literary histories, but I kept running up against the energy producing water of rivers and the oceans that were affected by oil spills, and also even the groundwater underneath my own town in California that carried the unwanted contamination of modern lives, including the contamination of oil production. I didn't intend to foreground rivers, but the Mississippi River, the Los Angeles River, even the Niger River run through my book about American histories, US histories of oil. Now, I had to think about why it is that these rivers and all of this water kept insisting that I look at it, that I address it. And I think rivers, at least, are certainly an aspect of modern energy systems and hydropower, but there's so much more than that, too. They're carriers of history, of indigenous and tribal knowledges and medicines, of community relationships over time. Some of the most profound writing in North America on energy has been about rivers, and I'm thinking about a Canadian Chinese poet named Rita Wong right now, who writes beautifully about what she calls the hydro commons of river life in BC, Canada. Now, part of my river orientation as a US scholar came from my experiences at a center called the Center for Land Use Interpretation. Now I would show you a slide of that. It's not a very good slide either, to be honest, but this is a center that has its primary location in Los Angeles, and it had a subsidiary location in Texas, in Houston, Texas, where the center was putting on a kind of exhibit about the lives of oil and the experience of oil production in Houston. The Center for Land Use Interpretation, otherwise known as the CLUI, and that's its acronym, has been a huge influence on my work in the energy humanities. The CLUI, again, a California-based center, focuses on the intersections of cultural geography and art. And they're best known, this center, for their infrastructure tours of the Los Angeles region, which connect tourists and people who live in Los Angeles to the often invisible systems which shape our lives. The CLUI has led both oil and water infrastructure tours throughout Southern California. And it's also known for its digital land use database, which is a kind of interactive map of obscure geographical features all across the United States. And anybody can take a look at that if you find that interesting. You can see where our nuclear waste facilities are, where our strategic oil reserves are, all kinds of things that aren't actually supposed to be mapped are in fact present on the CLUI's land use database. Now, the CLUI project in Houston used water as a means of intelligence, a way to get inside of the massive oil economy in Houston, whose scale edges on the inconceivable. Matt Coolidge, who is a co-director of the center, planned urban riverboat tours for Texans as a kind of back door into oil production sites, which are not often visible from land roads. Coolidge's infrastructure tours are a little bit like literary writing in the sense that participants are given the opportunity to develop a point of view on a subject that is small in its lived immediacy, but opens onto fields of experience which are vast. His work is an example of what I call live plotting in living oil. And this term, live plotting, is a term by which I mean enacting a narrative by moving self-consciously through a landscape, developing a relationship with that landscape by honing one's point of view. In other words, really reading a landscape. CLUI infrastructure tours and the center's digital land use database introduced me to a version of environmental media studies reflected by both the study of infrastructure and a teacherly practice of site specificity. Now, as I wrote Living Oil, I began to think a lot about what it might mean to do site-specific literary and cultural criticism. And I began to layer my literary reading with oral histories. So actually going out and talking with people and taking oral histories of a certain area, and with local museum visits in the area that I was interested in writing about, and with on-site observations and re-narrations of places that I had encountered in novels or poetry or film. So I really began to try to see if it were possible to read from within, but then beyond cultural texts, and to engage with actual people and actual landscapes that cited the texts that I wanted to write about. Now, part of the project of what one critic calls my method of old new materialism, or new old materialism, I think is what she calls it. In other words, bringing new materialism and quote unquote the old materialisms together, has been that of reconnecting energy as a modern charismatic concept and as a spectacle to the actual landscapes and peoples most affected by modern energy. It was the US historian Richard White who first called my attention to the embodied and relational aspects of energy in his classic history of hydropower development on the Columbia River, which is actually near my current home in Oregon. White breaks the energy concept back down into work that humans and non-humans do together. So again, for White, energy is work that humans and non-humans do together. He writes, quote, "Work involves human beings with the world so thoroughly that they can never be disentangled from it." His point is, I think, first, that for many North American and particularly US environmentalists, we often have missed, at least in the past, the crucial ways in which work and not leisure forms lifelong relationships with non-human lives, with animals, with non-human forces. Moreover, White conceives of power as the attempt to command energy, to bring humans, water, even oil into subjection. His book, The Organic Machine, begins with a study of European American settler colonialism in the Columbia Valley, where salmon runs and the indigenous cultures that rely upon them for sustenance have been gradually destroyed in order to support a modern hydropower system. And I mentioned White as a sort of predecessor and maybe less persuasive version of the indigenous American scholars, including Nick Estes, Kyle Powis White, and Winona LaDuke, who have written eloquently about how colonial power violated indigenous relationships with rivers and threatens both indigenous and settler futures. So the ways in which colonialism and capitalism came together to create energy systems which are not only unsustainable for everyone, but explicitly damaging and violating of indigenous relationships with water. Now, Richard White didn't go far enough into the traumas of colonization for both indigenous peoples and frankly for the settler colonialists as well. But he did kind of begin to open that subject back in the 90s. As the indigenous American poet Sherman Alexie has written, has anybody ever said that dam building is an act of war against Indians? And of course, Alexie is talking about indigenous Americans when he uses the word Indians, but of course, people have said that dam building is an act of war against Indians, and I think about Arundhati Roy's very important work, including the essay, The Greater Common Good, which offers a version of this question in her own discussion of the massive dam projects in India that have displaced farmers and tribal communities. So when we talk about modern energy, we are always talking, I think, about the possible misuse or the actual misuse of power. Now, my final topic is the topic of skill, which I describe as sort of the site where humans meet the world at this skill. Skill becomes kind of the interface of human and non-human forces. When I consider how my primary field, which still is literary studies, attempts to understand the relations of humans to other matter, I often just find myself thinking of the word skill. And I want, for the sake of this talk anyway, to let skill stand for the world making that energy workers, that artists and writers, that all of us who do some kind of work do as we're living fossil fuel modernity. When I visited Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada, which is the center in some respects of oil sands mining, in 2011, I flew up there by myself after seeing images of devastation of the boreal forest on Google Earth. And I actually wasn't that far when I was living in California. It was one flight to get up to Calgary, and then I could take a small plane into Fort McMurray. And I went over there, and I found myself able only to steal glimpses of human scale activity, rarely to come down from the aerial view that I had had coming into Fort McMurray on that small plane. I managed to speak with the girlfriends of some oil workers, with service providers like taxi drivers and food vendors, but the man camps where the oil workers live were completely inaccessible to me, in part because I was a tourist, but also because I'm a woman. And the work of mining was only visible to me at a glance on an energy tour offered by the Canadian corporation Suncor. Since my visit to Alberta, I've relied on other cultural producers like filmmakers and visual artists to animate my own writing about the people who are working in tough oil extraction zones. And let me just say a word about the term tough oil. Tough oil is a term that the journalist Michael Clare has used to describe a suite of extractive practices that became commonplace as the most accessible global oil reserves started to dry out in the early 20th century. Tough oil includes fracking, oil sands production like that going on in Alberta, and ultra deep ocean drilling, be it below 5,000 feet. We glimpsed tough oil lives in places in the United States like North Dakota. There's a terrific short film that you can access on Vimeo called Crude Sweet Man Camp, by Isaac Gale, where you'll see North American men whom Gale captures on film, piercingly alone, living in overpriced work camp housing, these man camps, which cost so much that even these oil workers, who are some of the highest paid in the world, cannot afford to live in them. You'll also see men living in their cars in the sub-zero weather of North Dakota and suffering sometimes even death from that level of exposure. So Crude Sweet Man Camp is a kind of almost I don't know how to describe it, a kind of a melancholic look at what the American dream has come to mean in the 21st century. So again, as we think of skill as a site where humans and non-humans become intimate and create something together, American literature has long foregrounded the beauty of such material intimacies, from the whale hunt, as described famously by Melville and Moby Dick, to the making of a pancake on an improvised camp stove, as described again iconically by Ernest Hemingway. The question of honoring skilled labor in the context of modern energy production has been of interest to both popular and countercultural media in the US, from a short film like Isaac Gale's film I just mentioned, to Paul Thomas Anderson's blockbuster Hollywood film, There Will Be Blood, which was released at the leading edge of the US shale boom in the 21st century. Anderson's Hollywood oil epic reflected nostalgically on an earlier era of oil discovery in the US. The slow violence attached to conditions of fossil fuel extraction today, like these overpriced dorms that I was talking about in oil boom towns, or the sexual harassment and even sexual assault that have grown up around the man camps in places like North Dakota. And by the way, these kinds of sexual violence are often most profoundly affecting indigenous communities that are around the boom towns, or even the slow violence of drug addictions that oil workers often develop because of their overtime shifts, the very long hours that they work. These kinds of, again, slow violence, to use Rob Nixon's term, aren't the stuff of Hollywood film. They're not the stuff of the sort of mythic American ideas of energy. Yet it's such forms of slow violence and underreported sexual violence wearing away at people and ecosystems that, to my mind, most injures the practice of skill, the possibility of creative collaboration between humans in the material world. And because I wrote a book called Living Oil, I've gone to many places, many universities in the United States where a lot of people's families are involved in oil production. And I have to say that I've met a lot of people who work in the oil industry and are very proud of the skilled labor that they perform, even as their jobs fail to make sense anymore in an economy that really must need shift to renewable energy. Skilled labor trapped within nihilistic industries is how I tend to think of it. And it's just a very sad thing to see. Now, briefly, I want to say something about other ways that one might conceive of skill by talking specifically about an artist whose work is centered on the indigenous community of the Ogoni in the Niger Delta area. 5 years ago, the British Nigerian artist and filmmaker Zina Saro-Wiwa began creating her first solo exhibit, which offers an edgy and almost utopian counter-narrative to global energy hegemonies, emphasizing the power of traditional Ogoni culture and skills, like small plot forming. I was one of 3 scholars who worked as a consultant with Saro-Wiwa on her exhibit, which is titled, Don't You Know We Taught Them How to Dance? And it was first showed in Houston. And in Zina's exhibit, which there's a wonderful video installation called Karipo Pipeline. And this is actually the photo I really wish I could show you, but maybe I can send it at some point. And it's a still from this video installation, which you will see an Ogoni man in traditional Karipo or antelope costume dancing on top of dilapidated oil infrastructure in the Delta. In this work, Karipo Pipeline, which is just a beautiful, beautiful video, is the only work that Zina created for this show that directly addresses the Niger Delta's energy economy. But of course, oil haunts the entire exhibition, and it haunts Zina Saro-Wiwa herself because of the state-sanctioned murder of her famous father, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who co-led a campaign, of course, to end the abuses of the Royal Dutch Shell Corporation in Ogoniland. Zina Saro-Wiwa describes the young male dancers in Karipo Pipeline as, quote, being alive within and on top of oil, an idea that I think might apply to all of her work, whose purpose is to foreground, in her words, quote, what we have that oil doesn't understand, meaning what's generative about Ogoni culture and cannot be stolen or securitized by oil, by global capitalism, by, for that matter, the American environmentalists, people like myself, who might want to attach ourselves to the legacy of Saro-Wiwa's father. Saro-Wiwa was very concerned about environmentalists from places like the US and England really misunderstanding her father's relationship to both the Delta and to the oil industry, which was complex. But Zina Saro-Wiwa uses a drone to film the Karipo dancers' muscular dancing on top of SPDC oil infrastructures in an ironic gesture of counter-surveillance. And there's like the kind of beauty, humor, and a resistance in this art, which is about traditional mask making, traditional dance, and just the kind of cultivation of traditional community organizations, even in a landscape that's been devastated by oil extraction and its histories. And I make this brief reference to the artist Zina Saro-Wiwa to indicate a thriving world of indigenous activism and art and scholarship that resists the cultures of fossil fuel extraction. Some of the most important work in energy activism and the energy humanities now comes from indigenous peoples whose traditional knowledges lead to very different concepts of the good life than what we see in petromodernity. And I feel the need to say that because I didn't really, directly address those scholars when I was writing Living Oil, because I didn't know about them yet. But those people are really important people to be thinking with and reading now. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that I think energy systems are becoming more and more central to humanity's thinking, teaching, and research. And I would argue, at least, that these studies that we might call, taken together, the energy humanities, are making all of us who participate in them more intelligent about what it has meant to be modern, what it has meant to be human within the last few hundred years of what has been called by some modernity, and also what it might mean to transition out of that particular definition of humanness and out of the fossil fuel era, technologically, culturally, and philosophically. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for speaking to us this morning with references to your personal experiences as well as literary expressions. Next, we have Dr. Swarlipi Nandi, Assistant Professor of English at Loyola College, Hyderabad, responding to Professor Lemenageau's talk on thinking oil and water. Over to you, Dr. Nandi.
Good morning, everyone present here. Thank you, Stephanie, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. And these are some of the questions that we need to gloss over. Maybe in our interactive session, we'll just come with more questions. I just want to kind of not summarize, but rather, focus on the main points that you raised so that it is easier for our respondents to focus on the questions. Some really interesting and quite revealing questions that we had today from your talk. The first thing is regarding how energy and fossil fuel based energy has become part of our daily lives. When you say everyday Anthropocene, I mean, we are living through that time. We are living through that experience without really realizing what we are doing and how we are consuming energy and how it has become part of our daily lives. I mean, that's the most fascinating and the most mind-boggling part of it, that the entire invisibility of an energy systems in our daily lives, from the time we wake up to the point we go to sleep, we are enmeshed in energy. So how do we, step back and see energy as something that we can look at it critically? So that's one thing that really we could talk a little bit more. Other things, you have focused on the American system of energy and specifically in terms of what it means to be a petromodernity or a petroculture. But I think your observations are valid for energy systems all over the world because petromodernity has reached India and other places as well. Recently, we have so much talks about fuel hikes and everybody is worried. And they're like, how are you going to survive if petroleum becomes so expensive? So it has become such an integral part of our modern lives that becomes an essential commodity for us. So India also is a petromodern state, if you can say that in a way. So definitely, I mean, oil as consumption to oil or understanding oil and infrastructures of oil critically is a task that the scholar in humanities will need to look at, which brings us to the third point that you are making. How do we as scholars of humanities and literature particularly step into this conversation? Because for a long, long time, energy systems, energy transitions have been areas where policymakers, where political thinkers, where sometimes geologists, sociologists, these are the fields of study that have kind of dealt with it. So the intersection of humanities with energy system is something pretty recent. And we need to ask this question, how do we figure here? What is our role in it? What are we going to look at? What questions are we going to ask? In a recent interview, I was asked, when I was talking about the problems of our current energy systems, I was asked, what do you suggest as an alternative? What is the way out? And my answer was that I am not a policymaker. you have to find better ways. Our task as a literary critic is to point out where we are going wrong, and maybe take cues from different ways in which we use imagination in creative writing and creative thinking, like the way you were talking about the different music, the different works of indigenous communities that have come up that give us a cue into how we can go ahead from here. But our role as a literary scholar, as a humanities scholar, is something that is very important for us to look at. What is the role of literary studies, especially when, again, literary studies takes into account a cultural form that, again, is dependent on energy. So when we are talking about literature, we are talking about print. We are talking about accessibility of literature. How do we make ourselves accessible to literature? How did and literature become accessible to us from the Middle Ages to the modern age? And we go back to the printing press. And then we are back to square one, where we say that, okay, even literature cannot be extracted away from literature. We cannot act holier than thou and say that, okay, fine, we are, the ones who are not into energy, and we can look at energy. Literature, the production of literature, the dissemination of literature. When a book has been printed and it's reaching us, how is it reaching us? It is reaching us through the, the Amazon carrier package that is coming to us. How are we getting it? So these are questions that we need to ask very, very critically in terms of how we are enmeshed, even as literary scholars, into issues of energy. I really liked a particular sentence that you used, and I'm just going to quote you again. You said that energy, understanding energy as specific material assemblages caught up in a capitalistic network. I think understanding that is very important. I mean, this is enmeshed in a network, and to pull out separate actors in that network is something that is very difficult to do. So we really cannot, compartmentalize different things here. We have to see it as part of a network, and we have to see that how these material assemblages come together to make this network happen and run over and over again for so many years together. Water as energy also is a very interesting, take in the field, because usually when we talk about energy humanities, we have mostly focused on oil, and in the Indian context, sometimes, as I'm working on coal as well. But mostly energy humanities is kind of like, synonymous with the list of bibliography that we have, Living Oil, After Oil, Simmons, and all other works, Dominic Boyer's work. So they are all about petroleum mostly. It's interesting how you bring in water as well, because when we talk about renewables again, solar energy, wind energy, water energy, and we kind of tend to see them as magic elixirs that will solve all our fossil fuel related problems. And now we have a lot of work that is also looking at, the different problems and the different questions that we need to ask regarding water as well, because going back to the basic question is that of extractivism. So, I mean, doesn't matter what resource we are talking about, doesn't matter what form we are talking about, but we are talking about a particular system in which we have come to see certain natural resources as things we can keep on extracting. When we're talking about tough oil, we're going down till that deep. I mean, we'll not stop at anything. I mean, if the top layer is exhausted, we'll go down, because it is a way, it is a perspective of looking at natural resources as something that we can take, we can extract, and we can keep extracting no matter what the consequences are. Which again, brings back to the questions that you were raising about the whole process of extraction and what it means for communities who are living on the contact zones. The local communities, the indigenous communities. I mean, once in a while, we'll see, somewhere in one corner of the newspaper, some report about, local Adivasi communities or other communities, even in India, they're protesting. And immediately, the person who's sitting in an urban center, sipping his coffee nicely, under an AC, and is like, what's the big deal? I mean, can't they just compromise a little bit? We are doing it for development. So these are, again, very, very crucial questions that we need to ask, what it means for the community there. And I found your perspective very fascinating when you speak about site-specific literary and cultural analysis. Like, I mean, there's no one parameter through which we can understand this. we have to make it site specific. We have to be there. We have to understand the specific bioregional and ecosystems that work there in terms of how communities and landscape and people interact, which again brings us to a very, very important point that we made about, again, not compartmentalizing the human and the non-human. This, as all of us, I think, are aware of, has been a long series of debate in terms of whether to understand the human and the non-human separately. And we can trace back our ideas to, as back till the time of, say, the 17th century, even earlier, when we are talking about how do we understand ourselves as people, as humans, and how do we understand our relationship with nature. And we have come to a conclusion. I think today we can say that all of us agree on this thing, that we cannot really separate the human and the non-human and the landscape, because if we are talking about extraction, if we're talking about extracting landscapes, we're also extracting certain elements of the human life out there. So it is not just landscape as terra nullis, which is out there. We're talking about entire ecosystems. We are talking about entire communities. We are talking about a large macrocosmic effect of extractivism, not just okay, fine, we have taken some materials from here and that's it, that ends the question. I mean, these are very, very interesting, critical questions. Maybe, as I was mentioning, that maybe in our interaction we'll have more responses from our participants. The impossibility to disentangle the human and the non-human and the landscape and everything. We are in a multi-species huddle. I mean, we really can't separate ourselves. Again, questions of the collaboration between, a very, very successful collaboration between colonialism and capitalism, and especially when we are talking about the global south in the context of India again, we have to look at how it begins for us, at what juncture. And the watershed moment obviously comes with colonialism, when we had this huge shift in energy systems, the way the British introduced the infrastructure and so on. So, they go hand in hand. Colonialism, capitalism, I mean, they're the best buddies. They have to go hand in hand, because that's how it works. The whole thing works. It's also interesting how you mentioned at the end of your talk about the Ogoni tribe and how, the Ogoni Delta and the energy activism that is concentrated there. So you are just, as I told you, I mean, you are no longer talking about America here. We are taking it on a global scale, because petro-modernity or petro-cultures are ubiquitous all over the world. So we really cannot, see any part of the world immune to it. Anyway, I would just mention that I am co-editing a series of essays with Steffi Balkan. You might know her. So we are collaborating. Our volume is titled as Oil Fictions, War Literature and Our Contemporary Petrospheres. And what we have done in that volume is that this is in production now. It will be out in another 2 months. And what we have done in that volume is that we have we have a list of scholars, a host of scholars who have looked at petrocultures as world literature, or in the world beyond America. So, and it's fascinating when we started receiving the essays from different scholars from all over the world. We were like, okay, we have Latin American petrocultural essays, then we have petrocultural essays from Iran, we have from Sri Lanka, we have from India, we have from other parts of Asia, we have the peripheries of Europe. So it was like, I mean, okay, fine. So we are there, and maybe it'll become a global project of activism, of resistance, of thinking about better futures, because energy humanities is not about providing solutions in terms of what better energy sources we can use. It is also about the ontological shift that we need to make in terms of thinking about energy, in terms of understanding energy and how it can be balanced with ecological and social welfare. So with this, I think we can open it up for the questions, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions and we'll have more fruitful discussions from our participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly enlightening and helpful. So I'm just going to turn off my mic and let others speak.
Stephanie, I would like to ask you a question, or perhaps a couple of questions also. You had spoken of water as a means of intelligence, and somehow that statement did strike me as a wonderful thought to hold on to, because I was thinking about Kerala itself, and we are fortunate to have many rivers flowing through the state. And many of the rivers, the place where we stay, the college is situated, Tiruvalla, and the Pamba River close to it. And I begin thinking of the times, especially during these months, when the river sand banks are exposed, when the water level goes down. And we have a lot of, this is a time when festivals, religious conventions also take place. And these sandbanks, from over hundreds of years, they are used as places where people come together for these meetings or for rituals or even celebrations. And I don't think we have thought about these rivers and these places, these sandbanks, as sites where energies pour through, or they converge. And sadly, the rivers are in a state of degradation now. The water level has reduced. There's a lot of sand mining going on for construction purposes, and grass has started growing on the sandbanks, and cattle is put out there for grazing, in fact. And when you spoke of, river water as a means of intelligence, I wonder how much, how feasible, or even how, whether that thought or even the possibility of something coming out of such a direction of thinking is possible at this stage, because so much has gone into destroying the ecosystem around this place. And another thing that, that the irony is that these places, the place where the colleges, if I say the local names, Kumbanad, Pullad, Tiruvalla, these are places which are extremely wealthy because a lot of the people are in the Middle East countries. And some of the wealthiest places in Kerala also, because you have lots of investments, bank accounts coming in, because you have people working in the Middle East. Petro money, you could say, which pours into these areas. And because of that, you have an aged population also here. Very few youngsters, large houses, hardly anyone staying in there. Because it's locked, or you have a couple of aged parents staying there. And it is only now that, it's interesting to put these things together, to see how connections can be formed between, these invisible flows of energy and, the kind of cultural changes, environmental changes that are happening right here. And I wonder if, whether we'll be able to harness the power of water, the kind of intelligence you talk. I wonder if, there's a sense of doom when I hear these words, actually, when you were speaking right now. I don't know, do you have any comments regarding this?
Yes, well, thank you for that. I mean, that's a really, actually in itself, a really beautiful and interesting reflection that you just offered. I want to say first that thinking about water as a mode of intelligence came to me from two thinkers that come to mind right now. And one of them is David Orr, who wrote an excellent essay many years ago called Reflections on Oil and Water, where he oil makes us stupid and water makes us smart, and then he says things that are much more interesting than that, but that's kind of the punchline of this essay about how different forms of energy have created different forms of sociality. And then I also think about Vandana Shiva, who's written similarly about oil and water. And now, more recently in the United States, we have indigenous nations writing as water protectors, and particularly around the Lakota demonstrations to move against the DAPL pipeline in the center of the United States. That was a really interesting moment where indigenous ideas about water as the basis of social life and welfare came up against the, in many ways, short-sighted and nihilistic sociality of fossil fuel. You know, and I do think, I mean, it's easy for me too to assume a kind of tone of doom and a perspective of doom, but I don't think that's very useful, because I think it's hard to be actively resisting under the shadow of doom. So, and I think we all need to resist in whatever way that we can, whether that simply means the way that we teach and the kinds of things we teach, or if it means something else. But I am very excited about the fact that there are these affinities developing between activists, young people, typically students, who are tired or just sick and tired of fossil fuel empires, you know, really kind of overshadowing what we thought was a democracy in this country. And there's an affinity between those anti-extractivist movements of young people across this country and indigenous nations who are seeing themselves in many ways coming into a kind of resurgence, as Leanne Simpson and others talk about, as climate change really throws into question a lot of the assumptions, that the kind of epistemologies that maybe many of us have lived with since the Enlightenment in Europe. So I feel like this is a really interesting time of potential transition, at least in my own country and from my own point of view, and I recognize that that's limited in certain ways. It doesn't mean that immense destruction isn't still to come, but I'm excited to see really deep-rooted anti-extractivist movements coming up in the last 10 to 15 years in the United States, and much more brightly in the last 5 years, I'd say, with indigenous people in this country beginning to lead those movements. And the fact that we are about to confirm an indigenous woman as the Secretary of the Interior Department of the federal government in the United States, which was the department that was once in charge of, quote unquote, managing our indigenous tribal nations. That's a really interesting moment for us historically. I'm not overly optimistic that it's going to change everything, but it is a really exciting moment where, again, we see the possibility of moving in a different direction. And I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I think that the degradation of rivers, more than maybe anything else, inspired the environmental movement in its earlier stages in the United States. I think about the burning of the Cuyahoga River, this river that caught on fire because it was so polluted in I think around 1969. I mean, that ignited a whole set of protections. I do believe that keeping water clean, keeping water safe for various kinds of community practices and participation is the foundation of a very sophisticated mode of being social. It's the ecological foundation of a very sophisticated mode of being social. And I feel, as an American, as a US American, that we've become much less sophisticated socially as a result of the energy, the easy energy that has undergirded a lifestyle of consumption and militarism. I think we've become stupid socially. I don't think we've ever been modern socially, to kind of maybe riff on Latour, if we've ever been modern at all. And so my hope is that the next phase of, you know, kind of trying to move somewhere together as humans is to develop a more sophisticated sociality that goes back to some of those fundamental ideas of living as water protectors first. So those are sort of my, you know, my hopes and my more emotional, I suppose, responses to what you said.
Okay. I think that to a certain extent, this answer what I was talking about. Yes. Okay. There's another thing that I was very curious about, Stephanie. It is regarding your the pedagogy the pedagogy that you use when you regarding environmental humanities. I understand that it is site specific. And can you explain a bit about that, because this is something really new, the field kind of explorations and visits that I believe that you and even the students make. Can you just elaborate on that? I'm curious about it.
Yes. Well, this in part comes into being, as I mentioned, from groups like the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which do what they call public pedagogy, where they go out into, in their case, the city. Typically, they go out into Los Angeles or Houston. They take groups of people and they sort of show people this is literally the infrastructure of your life. This is what is undergirding your sense of subjectivity, your sense of agency. This is the complex system in which you live. Let's begin to unpack that together and sort of realize how determined we are by that and how we might in some way, I don't know, move beyond it or have more agency within networks. But that's one influence for me. But the other influence is actually just that my undergraduate degree was in anthropology, and we did a lot of ethnographic work. And when I started working in a public university in the United States, we are supposed to be serving the public of our state in the US. But often we don't ever leave the urban or suburban enclave that the university is located within. And so I really felt like, we have a very big problem between urban and rural in the US, as do many parts of the world, where rural people, whether they're indigenous or settler peoples, don't feel connected at all to the cities and the suburbs. And so some colleagues and I have across the country, not just me, not just my university, have been thinking we need to get out and actually talk to these people whose children maybe are coming to our university, or maybe we hope that they will come, or we hope to encourage them to try to get good grades and come. And we need to find out what they think about the landscape, the ecology, the sort of future of climate in our region. In a way, we go out to sites like, for instance, I'm doing a book right now on the public lands in the United States, what we've meant by the public lands in my state, Oregon in particular. And a historian and I have gone out with small groups of students and done oral histories with ranchers, farmers, tribal communities to ask them about what the public lands have meant to them, whether they want to continue to safeguard this institution or whether they want to follow people like Donald Trump and privatize all of this land. So those efforts have been efforts to learn from the expertise of our rural communities who know a lot about ecology and climate, but who are politically often very distant from us at the university. And those oral history journeys often take us, for 4 or 5 days with student groups, small student groups of about 10 to 15 students. And I think it really affects the students' vision sometimes of who they are. Sometimes they're people from those areas. So that's also interesting. They get to come back with their university group and sort of translate a little bit with their new knowledges about maybe environmental science, but then talking about what their, relative, their cousin, knows about, what they've seen about climate change, for instance, that we might not even see because we're not out there farming the fields as they are. So it's an interesting way of trying to, I guess, respect the expertise of people who are primarily rurally located and not at the university. That's the project I'm working on now. But I always felt like I couldn't write about oil without also really going to places in my region. I mean, I couldn't travel everywhere, of course, but, where oil production was happening or had happened historically. And then finally making a little bit of a journey to Texas and a little bit of a journey to Canada just to see what the new tough oil frontiers looked like there in the time that I was writing. and to talk to people a bit there so that I wasn't imposing a kind of urban elitist perspective as much as I might be. I mean, I probably still am. I'm not sure I can entirely get away from it, but you know, I just wanted a little bit more of a sense of what the people who are working in these industries, for instance, feel, why they're there, what their hopes are. If we are going to move forward, I think we do have to go together. At least a good number of us have to begin to recognize that we're moving into a transition. And that's really what a lot of this public pedagogy is about. And then just better understanding and ground truthing a place is what the site visits are about. That was a long answer, I'm sorry.
No, it's very clear to me now, actually, what exactly, you know, I think it's very interesting that you're trying to go outside the environments of academia and trying to understand what happens on ground, rather than in the realm of ideas. I think that's excellent, actually. It's something that I think all of us must pursue. Yes. Yes. I wonder if there are any...
Go on, ma'am. Go on.
Please continue.
Oh, if there are no more questions, we could move on to the next session.
I think this is a new area for everyone, field. So I think someone has raised their hand. Yes.
Jyotis and George has raised her hand.
Yeah. Hi. Good morning, ma'am. So I just want to ask you a question. India being a developing nation and oil and water being overly priced and both the resources being used and abused even, how do you say that we draw the line? Where do we draw the line? Like, how do we draw the line? Because you've mentioned about water being something more than an energy, it carrying the voices of indigenous histories. So how do we draw the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, to be honest with you, I think I am not smart enough to answer that question, to be perfectly frank. But I do think drawing the line, if we, and I know we are not speaking from the same place, but I think worldwide, for different reasons, we all do have to think about drawing that line. And I think if we don't do it, the climate will do it for us, or some other force will do it for us, whether that's the forces of a kind of runaway colonialist capitalism, which I think you're talking about in part, and which I'm talking about too, or whether it's actually physical forces and just the profound changes that are going to come if our nations don't draw the line and don't begin to really preserve our water sources, respect the societies that have grown up around clean water and clean air, respect the fact that the climate that's allowed us to thrive as a species throughout this planet is disappearing. I mean, there is an interesting book by Naomi Klein that she wrote a couple of years ago, where she talks about what she calls blockadia. And what she means by blockadia is a kind of international movement of resistance at specific sites of extraction, that, people at specific sites of extraction where it's gone too far, find ways to resist. And it has to come from the grassroots of that given community, that given site. But then maybe it's a good idea, as Klein suggests, to recognize each other internationally, to not just sort of, you have to do what you must do in your site, and what you simply can do, which you feel like you can do in your own site, but then to recognize others, to find ways to connect internationally to these other movements that are going on in specific regions, specific towns, around specific extractive projects. so that we begin to see that this is, as I think Professor Nandi said, a worldwide problem and a worldwide movement, even though we're dealing with uneven development, we're dealing with colonialism and its legacies, which are much more profoundly violent in some places than others. But still, we're dealing with a worldwide movement, and yet only in our specific locales do we have the local intelligence, frankly, to know how to draw the line for us in a way that maybe we feel we can tolerate or survive. So I know that's not a very specific answer, but I think I would be lying and maybe overestimating my own intelligence to try to give you a more specific answer, but I really appreciate your question. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Ma'am, this is Harsha. So my question is, can we think about nuclear energy in this context? When you talked about energy humanities, what immediately came to my mind was a mini series I happened to watch in 2019. So
Yeah.
it was about the Chernobyl disaster. You might be familiar with it. I don't know.
Yes.
So can you elaborate on that nuclear energy in this context?
Yes, I think we must think of nuclear energy too. I know in my own country and many others, we have some people who are seeing nuclear energy as a way to save us from the climate crisis and move us away from fossil fuels. But at the same time, no one has solved the problem of how to dispose of the waste that comes from that kind of energy production. It's a very dangerous kind of production. There are all kinds of accidents occurring in the now aging nuclear facilities in my own country. There's one very close to where I live, in fact, which has been voted to be a very, very dangerous facility. So yeah, I mean, nuclear energy is very much something that we should all be thinking about. To go back to Dr. Nandi's question, how do we in the humanities address this? I'm not an energy policy maker. I'm not an engineer, but I do think that the way that we imagine possibilities, the way that we decide we're culturally comfortable with things, affects the direction ultimately that our societies move. And obviously individuals come together in aggregates, and that's what begins to move us in particular directions socially. But we can all do that cultural work of imagining and thinking. I know a scholar named Anindita Banerjee, actually scholar originally born in India. I forget where she was born. I apologize, Professor Banerjee. Good friend of mine actually at Cornell University. And she's writing a book right now, a kind of comparative look at cultural histories of nuclear energy. I believe that she's looking at both India and the former Soviet Union. It's definitely worth thinking, with not just the engineers, not just the policy wonks, but also with sci-fi authors and with cultural historians about what nuclear energy means for a social world, for social welfare, for individual sense of agency, for the kinds of communities that we will create as we move ultimately, which I think we will, but I don't know how, exactly how this will happen, or if it will happen as a result primarily of disaster, as we move away from fossil fuels.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes, Priyanka, you may ask the question.
Good morning, ma'am. You were talking about site specificity. This is about oil in particular.
Yes.
Can we compare the emergence, the excavation, and the existence of oil in different countries like the Gulf, the America, and Nigeria? Because there are a lot of things that are common in all of these. We have sacrifice zones there where an oil excavation happens. There There's the influence of imperialism, displacement, ecological degradation, etc. But then their social, political, economic, and cultural status makes it very difficult to compare them or consider them as a homogeneous body. Like while America is a country which thrives on oil and has built its modern capitalist society in oil economy, the Middle East Arabian societies have a different story, wherein there are modernization have given rise to these backward monarchies. There are oil wars, and when it comes to Nigeria, you could say that there is a lot of economical disaster, or there's a rape of the environment that had happened there. So how do you, I would like to know your comment on this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And thank you for your really brilliant, actually, you did a tremendously good job of comparing all of those places. So you almost sort of perform in your own brilliance the possibility of such comparison. I don't pretend to do that. I mean, I personally think that in my own work that the frame of the region is extremely important. So in my book, Living Oil, for instance, I'm primarily looking at California and Texas. California, seen as the most environmentally forward-thinking of the United States, Texas as one of the most environmentally backward-thinking, but in fact, the two major sites of oil production in the country, and California right behind Texas in terms of oil pollution and the production of various greenhouse gases. So that was where I focused, but I think what's interesting, and this kind of goes to your point as well about how there are these sort of overarching, maybe potential similarities. What's interesting is that because of the oil industry, like many industries which we can think of as part of global capitalism, there's a tremendous amount of internationalism within sites of oil production, transshipment, certainly places like Houston, where a lot of the corporate headquarters have been located. You know, you have Houston being one of, I think, is the most international city in the United States today, right in the heart of Texas, which we also think of as one of the most, I guess, sort of monocultural places in the US. So I think that internationalism, which in its darkness is associated with colonialism and the impositions of capitalism, also creates a tremendous amount of intelligence sometimes in oil sites and makes regional places into also world cultures on some level. So that's kind of what interests me, looking at the regional frame, which is something that I feel like I can actually handle, that it doesn't, you know, overtax my intelligence too much, but then recognizing that in that regional frame, you can't just see something like a monoculture, like a, you know, hyper-local culture. You also have to recognize that it's shot through with international energies and with international populations. And that might be something that, you know, I have a method that I use in Living Oil called commodity regionalism, where I talk about particular commodities, and in one case just being fuel, that circulate through a regional landscape and actually profoundly shape the local ecologies of that landscape, but also are part of an international marketplace, and so bring kind of the energies of that internationalism with them as well. But I agree with you. I think it's potentially quite dangerous to compare as if somehow you're looking at sort of homologous types of cultures that operate around oil extractivism. That is not the case. And yet, as Michael Watts and other scholars have shown, Watts writing extensively about Nigeria and the Gulf Coast of the US, there are ways in which comparisons can be fruitful.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for your question and your beautiful, again, sort of summations.
Thank you.
I guess there are no more questions. I think we'll go on to the next session.
Thank you. Am I audible?
You are.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Next, we get to listen to Dr. Swarali Nanti, Assistant Professor of English at Loyola College, Hyderabad. She's currently working on colliery narratives of India and studies how 20th century literature engages with the emergence of the Indian coal economy from a post-colonial perspective. Having her PhD in English from Kent University, USA, with a research focus on post-colonial literature in the era of neoliberal globalization. She is a member of the Petrocultures Research Group of the University of Alberta. Her works have been published in many journals of international acclaim and is currently working on a monograph titled Narrating the Fringes, the Changing Narrative of Poverty in 21st Century. Indian English Fictions, um, and it is contracted by Routledge. She has also edited 2 books, The Post-Colonial Fantasy, Essays on Post-Colonialism, Cosmopolitics and Science Fiction, and another one, Spectacles of Blood, a study of violence and masculinity in post-colonial films, apart from the works that she has co-authored. A well-known figure in the international scholarly circles. It's a great privilege to have you with us today, Dr. Nandi. I invite Dr. Nandi to deliver the talk on contextualizing energy humanities in India. Dr. Nandi, please.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm very thankful to Dr. Philip for her kind invitation, and I'm really honored to be a part of this excellent lecture series. This has been a wonderful morning of conversations, of thinkings, of ideas, and I hope that we continue with that. I have a very short PPT, which is not really required, but nevertheless, I'll just share the PPT so that we can have a look at the main points that I'll be talking about today. So I'll just share my screen. Give me a minute. There's some background noise that is coming. I don't know if it's coming from my end or if somebody's unmuted among the participants.
Right now, no one is unmuted.
Yeah, this has stopped. It has stopped. Thank you. All right. Please let me know if you're able to see the slides.
Yes, we can see it now.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the title of my talk is Contextualizing Energy Humanities in India. And I seek to continue from where Stephanie concluded, that is, we need to talk about the discourse of energy humanities and in the context of post-colonial nations like India. So what I intend to do today is more than offering conclusive answers, I plan to offer a roadmap to the various avenues in the field and the critical questions we might seek in the context of energy through the lens specifically of humanities and more particularly of literary and cultural studies. We know that an increasing awareness of macrocosmic climate change questions and more mundane concerns of recent hike in the petroleum prices have led to more pressing questions of our fossil fuel dependence and speculations about alternative energy resources. If we look at the figures regarding India's use of energy and consumption of energy, we see that the numbers are quite impressive. So this is just a statistical representation of India's energy use at a glance. And we can see that India was the third largest electricity producer in the world with almost 1383 TWh generation in the financial year 1920. A lot of the population have access to power supply. It is one of the world leaders in renewable energy investments and installations. By 2022, India claims to have fulfilled a target of at least 175 GW of renewable energy capacity. We also know that India is also the world's third largest energy consuming country. And with the rising incomes and the improving standards of livings among its populations, we see the numbers just going up. The energy use has doubled since 2000, and with 80% of the demand, as we can see from the pie chart, being met by coal. So a majority of the demand has been met by coal. Apart from that, we use a lot of oil. So we are primarily dependent on the fossil fuels. And there are several policies that are formed with the aim of enabling India with total renewable energy sources by 2030. At present, in terms of solar energy, we receive an equivalent of almost 5,000 trillion kilowatts per year, which is far more than the total energy consumption of the country. Now, these numbers may lead to a statistical euphoria, but there are critical questions that remain to be asked about our energy use, our energy production and distribution, and its social and political implications in terms of its impact on the planet and climate change. Since energy humanities in India is an emerging field, there are several unexplored arenas that we as scholars of literature might seek to venture into. So let us try to envision some critical research questions that the research in the field might offer. So we can ask questions like, what does the history of India's energy regime, specifically the colonial systems of energy, entail? How do we critically understand India's present energy networks as socio-political structures? And along with that, we ask the question, how do we envision the political economy of sustainable energy futures? In my research on energy humanities, I address these questions through the tropes of social and cultural ramifications of energy, or as Zeman and Boyer would put it, to quote them, the why and how of energy. There are certain counter arguments that complicate our critique of fossil fuel energy as a social concern, especially in the context of India. Fossil fuels have been fundamental forces that propelled India to modernity and technological progress. And therefore, the developmentalist rhetoric argues that countries of the global south cannot sustain themselves without relying on cheap, reliable fossil fuels, ensuring a form of carbon dependence that ironically becomes an integral part of the decolonization process of self-reliance. So we're caught in this double bind, that on the one hand, we want to have access to cheap, reliable fossil fuel energy, which can be supplied by fossil fuel, but the other hand, we are also talking about the environmental impact of fossil fuels. So when it comes to the global south in post-colonial nations, the question becomes very complicated. Tucker Devi, one of the scholars, point out, and I quote him, that global warming typically takes a backseat to feeding, housing, and employing this country's citizens. Thus, the path to more development is paved through increasing carbon footprints of the poor and middle-income countries, which, according to World Bank again, already account for just over half of the total carbon emissions. Deepesh Chakrabarty has a very interesting example to cite in one of his talks. He says that he cites the example of air conditioner use among the lower middle class people of Delhi. And he says that there was a sudden hike in the use of air conditioners. And when research was done on that and the impact that climate might have because of the, carbons and the chlorofluorocarbons that air conditioners release, it was seen that the air conditioners were seen as important steps towards social mobility. So these people were claiming that because of the air conditioners, the children could study better, and that would provide them with an opportunity to go beyond the social class that they were in. So this is a very critical question that we are talking about here, because to just blindly, criticize fossil fuels, saying that, okay, we'll do away with fossil fuels completely, is a very, very difficult question to address, especially when we come to post-colonial nations and the countries of the global south. So we kind of get enmeshed into this, this whole debate of northern versus southern environmentalism in terms of prioritizing carbon abstinence. Because a call to deconsumerize and a quest for alternative energy forms are often read by some scholars, as post-materialist concerns arising predominantly from the north, where basic amenities are already available to the larger population. And Indian environmentalists like Ramachandra Guha quotes the British journalist who cogently comments, to quote again, "When everyone turns environmental, prosperity has truly arrived. Greenness is the ultimate luxury of the consumer society." The same thoughts are echoed by Amitav Ghosh, who voices similar concerns regarding the conflicting priorities between the developed and the developing countries in the context of fossil fuel use. And this is what Ghosh says. He says, "Perhaps we should abandon the quest for Western-style prosperity so that a greater number will survive. But this would require the abandonment also of the project of modernization that was often implicit in decolonization. It would put a freeze on a system of colonial-style inequality," unquote. So the utter imbalance of power and privilege among geopolitical regions shaped by empire and the impetus for decolonization through industrialization creates an impasse of priorities against a looming climate catastrophe. Ghosh seems to propose a solution that he himself, of course, touts as absurd. He says, "Let the third world develop while the first world sacrifices its energy use until an equitable global balance is reached." Petroleum's relationship, for example, with the developing nations have been often touted as a pathway to a better life and an integral part of the developmental plan, which can be modified to better use but cannot be replaced. Now, being in this situation, what then can be our take on oil or any other fossil fuel? The question that we ask is that, does the need for development outweigh the threat of imminent climate disaster? Is the call for alternative energy sources mostly a northern initiative? The dilemma is perhaps not so daunting, because fossil fuels are as essential modes of extractivism, and they affect unequal power relations among communities and ecosystems. In a recent essay, Jennifer Wenzel and Imre Zeman described extractivism as a process where, in a perverse cycle, raw resources are being dragged out of Earth and back to the colonial metropole as feedstock for the manufacture of a modernity to which the periphery is supposed to catch up culturally, socially, and politically. A fundamental critical idea that informs my work is that fossil fuels affect what we can call as a Marxist idea of a metabolic drift. And we can define it as, to quote, "the capitalist production as a process that disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and earth," unquote. So though primarily conceptualized in the context of depleting soil fertility, the notion foregrounds a common coordinate of human and natural exploitation. It is imperative to understand that the structures of energy in the past and present before envisioning an equitable and just future of energy, both for the humans and the environment. So to quote Zeman and Boyer again, "Energy transition will therefore involve not only a change in the kinds of energy we use around us, but also a transition in the values and the practices that have been shaped around our use of vast amounts of energy provided by the fossil fuels." In just our question number sessions, we were talking about different forms of energy. We were talking about whether we can move to water, whether we can move to nuclear energy, and so on. But the fundamental question here is that even if we move to nuclear energy or to water energy, what are the values that we are carrying in terms of exploring that energy? If we do not make a transition in the way we extract and we use Earth's resources, there will not be any change even if we move to that. I'll come to that at the end of my talk when we talk about solar energy and its problems. So going back to where I was, let us look at some of the tropes of unequal power relations that characterize our energy systems. The advent of industrial modernity and the exponential growth of technology has been inadvertently linked with the growth of the fossil fuels, primarily coal, as the primary source of energy. The fossil fuel regime, however, as Andreas Malm convincingly argues, is essentially built on the accessibility of exploitable labor. Asserting that the transition to coal power from an earlier water power was spurred not by its relative cheapness, but rather by the availability of cheap labor that eased transport, Malm assigns materiality to energy transitions as an integral part of the proletariat's relation to the industrial capitalist system in both Britain as well as the empire. So for Mam, the fossil fuel regime is intricately attuned to capitalism's inherent characteristic of expropriation through wage labor. For, as he says, to quote, no piece of coal or drop of oil has yet turned itself into fuel, and no humans have yet engaged in systematic large-scale extraction of either to satisfy subsistence needs, unquote. Essential to Mam's theory of energy transition is thus the malleability of coal to suit capitalism's tenets of time and place abstraction that allowed for a more amorphous, more transitory source of energy that maximized control over labor. Now, the same trajectory can be seen in India's coal transition as well. If we go back a little bit into history and see where we actually start being a coal nation, we see that India's foray into coal energy invokes a long history of commercial coal mining covering almost nearly 200 years, starting from 1774 by the Messrs. Sumner and Heatley of East India Company in the Raniganj coal field along the western bank of River Damodar. Coal in India has been a colonial capitalistic venture that hinged on the exploitative extraction of both the indigenous environment and the local mining labor. Coal mining ushered in one of the earliest private entrepreneurships during the Raj, based on the tripartite extractive system of Indian entrepreneurs on the one hand, then we had the tribal laborers on the other, and then the colonial government as the primary consumers of coal. The colonial coal regime thus became part of what Jason Moore would call as one of the commodity frontiers. There were, of course, other commodity frontiers during colonialism. We have indigo, we had opium, we had tea, coffee, and so on. But among them, coal was also commodity frontier, which Jason Moore defines as, to quote him, encounter zones between capital and kinds of nature, humans included, unquote. So the frontiers of colonial coal extraction also testify to an insidious system of both human and non-human expropriation affecting a metabolic rift in the Marxist sense of the term. Now, having looked at the history, how do we as literary scholars engage with questions of energy? How do literary texts map energy histories? So most of the early pioneering scholars of the field have repeatedly harped on the issue of invisibility of energy in cultural texts of a period. Now, the question of invisibility that Graham MacDonald explains has less to do with the sensory lack of vision and more with the public indiscernibility of energy's infrastructure and procurement, or as Imre says, it suggests an, to quote him, epistemic inability or unwillingness to name our energy ontologies, unquote, that essentially banks on the unequal power relations of an energy economy. So for Imre Ziven, though the history of modernity has been registered in relation to the development of new literary forms, scientific discoveries, urban growth, in the expression of political freedoms and new ideologies and the creation of contemporary political structures, leaving energy out of our picture of modernity, and indeed out of any period of history, has meant that we lack a full understanding of the forces and the practices animating not only its politics and economics, but also its social and cultural life, close quote. In one of the earliest contributions to the field, Patricia Jaeger suggests countering this energy invisibility with locating presences of fuels in literary texts. To quote her, the stolen electricity at the beginning of Invisible Man, the marching fire road in Macbeth, the smog in Bleak House, the manure fires in Louis Verhulst's Labyrinth, the gargantuan windmills in Don Quixote, they can all be sources for the literary scholars to look at how energy has operated throughout the ages, unquote. So in a similar manner, working with regional literature, I look at texts from Bengali literature primarily. So what I do is I trace the carbon footprints of Bengal's emerging colonial modernization in the numerous literary references to another product of modernization, and that is railways, which again primarily dependent on coal, which, to quote Zeman, had ontologically reordered human existence in colonial Bengal in the deepest way imaginable and left its visible presence in the several novels of the 19th and the 20th century. The ubiquitous presence of coal and railways in the 19th century Bengali fictions both testify the novelty as well as the immense impact of steam power in radically restructuring the everyday lived experience of modern Bengal. Undoing energy visibility can include a sustained study of uncovering such cultural markers available in the codes of modernizing Bengal and a nuanced reading of the various ways in which energy shaped class privilege and class relations in a rapidly changing economy. There are, of course, certain literary texts that directly address the issue of coal extractivism. One of the writers, I'm looking at two primary writers here. These are writers from the mid-19th century from a group of Bengali writers called the Kollol group, and they wrote colliery fiction, and the writers are Shailajananda Mukhopadhyay and Achinto Sengupta, and they wrote the series of social realist fictions that narrate the structural exploitation of the environment and the coal mine workers like never before. What is interesting about Mukhopadhyay's text books is that he looks at coal extraction as a comprehensive process of extraction and not only just nature. So when he's talking about coal extraction, when he's projecting a cultural aspect of coal extraction, he looks at it as how it is operated by a colonial system, by the local businessmen who employ the Adivasis who are exploited as labor, and alongside there is this complete depletion of environment going on, and there is a very acute awareness of the environmental degradation that is going on. So these are very interesting texts to look at. Like coal, petroleum regimes are also fraught in power imbalances. Apart from oil's massive effect reach beyond the zones of contact, fueling myriad other forms of violence and human perpetration. Oil spills over in the form of petrodollars, spawning an immense network of global labor migration in oil economies, so utterly deterritorialized that it dismantles all notions of the local. Huge swaths of undocumented, unskilled laborers migrating from the margins of the global economies to UAE, Oman, Kuwait, and other Gulf nations, and sustaining the extravagant megacities of the petro empires of the Gulf testify to a system of utter exploitation, inhuman extraction, and human rights violation. Critiquing oil thus entails including into the discourse its concrete human cost and its apparent immutability. Mimicking the elusiveness of oil, this human workforce is largely invisible in both cultural and political imaginaries. They have rarely appeared in canonical Anglophone post-colonial fiction until recently, barring maybe through the brief oil encounter that we find of Alu in the mythic state of Al Ghazira in Amitabh Ghosh's Circle of Reason. You have, in Kerala, the writer Ben Amin's runaway hit, Goat Days, translated as Goat Days, the book which talks about the story of an abused Indian migrant worker in Saudi Arabia, which brings the Gulf's undocumented labor into wider literary discussions. The last couple of years have seen a host of other South Asian Anglophone fictions focusing on the group. We have Shyamlal Puri's Dubai Dreams and Dubai on the Wheels, which is on the undocumented taxi drivers of Dubai. There is Nikhil Ramtek's 365 Days that narrate the dark underbelly of Dubai that lies beneath its ultra-modern, urban shimmer. Mohana Lakshmi Rajkumar's Migrant Report that present a motley band of migrants and their stories. Saudol Sano's The Bamboo Trunk, and Deepak Unnikrishna's Temporary People, which received a lot of attention and rose to global prominence following its Man Booker Prize. As I was mentioning, the forthcoming volume of essays that we are bringing out, titled as Oil Fictions, World Literature and the Contemporary Petrosphere, looks at petroleum cultures and extractive zones all over the world in different contexts. And one of the things that I am studying in my chapter is the concept of the petro labor and how this labor gets represented. What is also interesting is that there are several texts that are moving beyond the realist genre, because as literary critics, we are also interested in the form. So how do we narrate these experiences? How do we document these experiences? And we get to see that different other forms like magic realism, like speculative fictions, science fiction, other kind of fantasy literatures also play a very important role in projecting what we can call as the irrealist mode of narration. It doesn't need to be in the realist mode of narration. It can be the critical irrealist mode of narration. So these are the texts that we need to look at and see how they are representing the experience of the people who are on the margins but are part of this petroleum network. So one, absorbed into the fabric, these literary texts counter what Turner would call as the structural invisibility of the precarious expatriate, absorbed into the fabric of a capitalistic machinery and yet not recognized as the legal labor citizen. The precarious Gulf migrant labor replicate conditions of slavery, suggesting a more explicit connection between fossil fuel economies and the system of slavery. One needs to take up texts that make visible the energy slavery as well as explore aesthetic modes on exploitation beyond the genres of literary realism. A study in the field of energy humanities would invoke the hermeneutics of suspicion in reading renewable energy resources as a magic elixir of all existing problems. This is precisely what we were at before we started this talk, in terms of if we look at alternative energy resources, what are the cultural and social ramifications of that as well? Because if our energy use and if our understanding of energy is based on exploitation, extractivism, and expropriation, then would it really make a difference if we shift just the mode of another energy form? Environmentally, solar parks have been detrimental on microclimate and plant soil processes. So there have been several studies where it has been seen that solar parks, which are considered to be, the answer to our energy problems for the next generation, they majorly affect the microclimate of the region, plant soil processes, including productivity and decomposition. Renewable energy resources, just like the fossil fuels, operate on the same grids of socio-political power that characterize any extractive system. So just to mention two renewable energy resources and how they have operated in the same way as fossil fuels, many of us are aware of the Narmada Valley project and India's, the dark side of India's hydroelectric projects and their impact of indigenous communities in terms of displacement, in terms of affecting them very, very closely. The Narmada Valley project, of course, has risen to visibility because of Medha Patkar's, visibility in the media and so on. But then there are other structural violences that we can see in wind and solar power. One example that I can cite is of the Charanka solar plant that is touted as the biggest Asia's largest solar plant. It is built on a massive 5,384 acres, and it is projected as India's solution to reducing its carbon footprint. But when we look at it, we also see that this is built on the displacement of the pastoral Maldhari community, whose right to the common land has been usurped and unrecognized. Corporate-funded solar projects are thus built on the same logic of resource exploitation, mapped on existing power imbalances in society, with the Adivasis, the indigenous, and the local communities being sacrificed for the macrocosm of energy reliance. The field of energy humanities in India is thus rich with several prospects for new and sustained inquiries. Studying cultural texts through the trope of India's energy history could offer a nuanced understanding of India's modernity, its past, and its future. Thank you. Just before I end, I just wanted to point out the role of literature and how several literary texts are addressing several questions of energy, not usually in the traditional forms. So one form that has come out very interesting to address energy issues is the form of the graphic novel. And we have several graphic novels which are presenting the energy questions in a very, very interesting manner. I've just put some pictures from different graphic novels. The first one is from Arijit Sen's The River of Stories. Then we have Ganji's The Solar Grid, which talks about solar power. This talks about water power. All Quiet in Vikas Puri also talks about the politics of water use. And then we have Carbon by Daniel Boyd, talks about coal extraction. So as literary scholars, the opportunities are immense. We have a totally unexplored field lying in front of us. We can go back to the texts that are available to us. We can do a counter reading and reading between the lines in the texts that might not seemingly address energy questions openly. But energy is there everywhere. When you look through the text, when you develop this poetics, the energopoetics of reading text, we can see and understand how our modernity from the past has been shaped by energy and the forms of energy and the way we have engaged with energy forms in terms of how we understand our society. With this, I will conclude, and I will wait for questions or comments or discussions, then we can have. I'll exit the just
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nandi, for that very informative and very interesting talk. And what came across to me here, especially, is that renewable energies systems can also be very exploitative. And the second point that struck me was that the distinction between the kind of issues in the north and in the southern regions of the world are quite different. Because when you talk of India, we are talking of different what you can call castes of people which emerge around these energy production and extraction systems and sites also, which you do not necessarily find in the West. It's a very different kind of social rearrangement, and the structure itself seems to be very, very different. These are 2 points that came to my mind while listening to your talk.
Yeah, if I just might add a little bit to the point that you just made in terms of the structures that we already have in society and how do we map, our understanding of energy there. This is a very interesting point. And just to provide a little bit of glimpse into how our coal energy systems were forged in the colonial times. It's fascinating to look at how the existing structures and the stratification of society was used for energy extraction. The primary coal laborers during the colonial times and even now are the indigenous communities, the communities who are in the stratification of the Bengali society are at the lowest grade. So they were the ones who were engaged as the laborers. So the stratification was already there. I mean, it was not something that was created by energy systems. Energy system kind of, fit itself into it. And the Warwick Research Collective has this whole study of combined and uneven development, where they talk about, I mean, they borrow this idea from Trotsky, the idea of combined and uneven development. But their research talks about how the peripheries of the post-colonies and the peripheries of the metropolis also work on these existing stratification. So people who are already there at the bottom, they are the ones who are, again, in this whole structuring of energy extraction. They're ones who are coming at the bottom again, and they are the ones who are suffering the most. So the existing structures that we already have in society are not really challenged in terms of energy enabling. So it's working according to the same grid. So what you mentioned is very valid, and it's absolutely true. Because when we come to India, it is not simply just shifting from one. And that is why we ask the question like, okay, fine, we can think of moving away from coal and petroleum to water. Will it really help? who will have access to that energy? Who will be the ones who will be extracting that energy? Will it be equitable? So the question is not about the energy form. It is about how we have understood the extraction, the culmination and the dissemination of energy.
Okay, Stephanie, yes, you have a question. You go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really an informative and exciting analysis. So I wanted to ask a question, maybe kind of picking up on Dr. Phillips' question. You mentioned a couple of literary forms to think with, the graphic novel at the very end of the talk, but then what you call critical irrealist modes of fiction earlier in the talk. And I mean, I wonder if you find in those forms any way of thinking beyond these stratificatory hierarchical systems that simply replicate themselves regardless of the form of energy. Are there sort of alternative socialities and forms of cooperation that exist in these literary expressions, or is that too much to ask of literature?
The thing is, in the Indian context, science fictions of alternative futures is not really, a very rich field, because when we talk about, speculative futures, we are mostly looking at other literary traditions and not really in terms of India. Though we do have, I'll just cite a very interesting example of 19th century short story that was written by Shatyendranath Datto. It's a Bengali short story and it's called The Runaway Cyclone. It's called Palatok Tufan, or the Runaway Cyclone. And there is this huge looming cyclone that is coming to hit the coast of Bengal, and everybody's scared and they really don't know how to solve the issue. And there is this very quirky scientist who comes and he's like, oh, I have seen my wife calm down with a bit of oil. Hair oil. So why don't we try it on the cyclone? So he puts 2 drops of the hair oil there, and it totally, these are the kind of these are the forms that make you think, because you are asking questions about existing inequalities. But then, is there a solution beyond that? I don't think we have reached there. I don't think so. I have not come across solutions through literary texts. But what is important for us as scholars of Indian literature is that to identify the problem in the first place, to understand that this is a structure that needs questioning. Because as I was mentioning, the many a times we have internalized energy use and taken it for granted so much that we really don't ask questions about the life that we are leading and how it is being enabled by energy. So a text that I would also like to mention is Deepak Unnikrishan's The Temporary People. This is a collection of short stories on the petro-migrants in the Gulf. And he uses a series of techniques, magic realist techniques, critically realist techniques to talk about these Gulf migrants, which is again fascinating because usually most of our participants are from Kerala, and Kerala has a very rich history of focusing on the life of the Gulf migrant, the precariat migrant, not the ones who are actually doing good and have moved up on the top ladder. There are many who are going there and they face this unprecedented situations of exploitation. So Unnikrishan's book features these short stories, and some of them are what we would call as absurd solutions. Like, there is this story, if I may mention, Mufasa. Okay, in Mufasa, they grew people. So the solution that is given to solve this crisis of petro labor is that there is a scientist who has devised this way of growing human labor in the trees. And there is this endless cycle, supply of laborers. The problem that happens is that the laborers start growing brains and they start protesting and they start demanding for their rights. So I think even in the absurd solutions, whether we can see it in Palatok Tufan or in Unnikrishan's in Mufasa Grew People, we can see that, we are questioning the fundamental structures that are operating. And maybe, through this process, we might come up with more sustainable solutions. Who knows?
Thank you so much.
The platform.
Please continue.
Your questions, and you can, if you want to start a discussion, you can do that. Please do.
I'm sorry, did I miss anything? I couldn't hear what was being said.
In fact, waiting for the participants to raise a few questions,
Okay.
ma'am.
Sure.
Ma'am, in between to fill the gap, thank you for helping us land to that realization as to where we as pursuers of literature falls when it comes to connecting energy and literature. Thanks for that. And I would like to ask a question as to how realistically do you think we, as pursuers of literature, studying and researching on this issue, can bring about a change in the way world look at the issue?
Well, this is a fundamental existential crisis for all literary scholars. I mean, we have to constantly validate what we do and how we can contribute to the world. I think that our work is important because, as I said, that it should not be only you know restricted to only the academic cycles, because what Stephanie is doing and many others are doing, taking our work out. First, we need to identify the issues. First, we need to identify the problems, see how literature of the past and the present represent that, because cultural texts have immense power in reaching out to people and in changing the way we understand things. So by cultural texts, again, we do not mean only literature. I mean, there are people who have understood what Gulf labor is after reading Goat Days. So, the runaway success of Goat Days is something that made people realize a lot about what actually happens to the undocumented laborer. So literature has and always will play a very crucial role in becoming or in playing the conscience of society, in talking about things, in pointing out things if there is a problem, if becoming the voice for things that are usually not voiced. Again, by cultural texts, we also look at a wide plethora of cultural texts, literary texts, cinematic texts, treatises. We look at journal entries. My research in coal narratives, for example, entails a lot of journal entries by these coal supervisors who wrote down. There is a text by Kipling who wrote this whole series of Greedy Diaries. These are rich historical and literary documents to look at. Because unless we understand our energy past, it is impossible to understand our energy future. How did we come to this is very important. So I think in terms of contributing to a discussion in history, in terms of contributing to raising an awareness, in terms of contributing to thinking about the future, we as scholars of literature play a very important role. So I definitely believe in the enabling power of literature.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Here we have Chakravarti who want to raise a question. Over to you.
Ma'am, good morning, ma'am. My question is, where do we draw the line between the humanities and energy humanities? Because environmental humanities mainly deals with the policy and policy research. I think I'm very new to this field, but still, even energy humanities is somewhere dealing with the same idea. So, where can we draw the line? That is my question.
Energy humanities is actually a subset of environmental humanities. They're not two separate fields. So environmental humanities obviously is a bigger field which will cover different aspects of which area of environment you are looking at. So there are ocean studies, and there are energy humanities, and then there are interplanetary studies. So different aspects of that. What we need to look at here is, again, move beyond the aspect of policy making, because we are talking about humanities, and as humanities scholars or as humanities thinkers, how do we figure in the field? And we figure in the field precisely because policies again are based on ideas. Policies do not just come out of anything. So policies are based on ideas. Policies are based on demands that we make of a certain idea of equality and freedom that we envision in our democracy. So policies are a product of humanities thinking, if we can say that. So in a way, energy humanities focuses on specific aspects of environmental humanities, that is energies. But then again, as I told you, that there are several other aspects of energy of environmental humanities. It is an interdisciplinary field, so we have to work in collaboration with other scholars, and we cannot just extract that literary part and start working on it, because in order to understand what is happening in literature, we need to know history, we need to know what policies were formed, we need to look at the historical records of how these energy forms came into being. So everything is together. We are talking about an interdisciplinary field of study where we are looking at both theory and praxis coming together to create a more informed consciousness about our energy, present and past and futures. Okay, I hope I answered your question. I don't know if this is clear. Maybe Stephanie can also add a little bit about whether these fields are kind of subset. I mean, I believe that energy humanities is a subset of environmental humanities.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I had the same idea, but just for clarification, I thought of asking you, ma'am. Just an extension. Could you give some names of critics or writers who have who will give a basic understanding of this field to explore?
Definitely, there is an entire bibliography that is available. So I can share the list. We have the major scholars of the field from US. Stephanie Lemaire, Professor Lemaire is obviously one of them. We have Emery Zeman, we have Dominic Boer, we have many other names in the field who are, Jennifer Menzel, they are all working in the field. From UK, we have Graham MacDonald, who is working in the field. We have several, scholars who are exploring in the field through different contexts. So if you require a bibliography, I can definitely give it to you. A more complete bibliography of all the works can be, given to you. I would request the organizers to share my email ID with anybody who would like to take this forward. So I don't mind at all to carry on with this conversation, because a lot of work has been done in the field. But in the context of India, we really don't have a lot of work. So this is what I mean. This is a very new field in India, and we have a lot of opportunity to do things in this field. So it'll be very exciting to see more works coming out. I just mentioned my forthcoming book, which is again going to look at energy humanities from the perspective of the post-colonial studies. So it's titled as Oil Fictions, World Literature and Our Contemporary Petrosphere. It is forthcoming in the month of September. So there we have a collection of essays by several writers, several important scholars in the field. The term petrofictions, for example, was coined by Amitav Ghosh, as we all know. So he was one of the first ones to talk about how we do not have enough literary representation of our petroleum energy, use and our reality that shaped petroleum. So we have Amitav Ghosh, we have Ashley Dawson, we have Emery Zeman, we have Sherry Dickard. She's working on energy humanities and environmental humanities in University of Ireland. So several people from the literary field are working on this. So I can give you definitely a more exhaustive list of scholars that you can look at.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.